How's everybody doing this morning? We're here to talk about building search-driven Windows 8 applications on SharePoint 2013 Search. This is really awkward behind these screens. My name is Paul Summers. I'm a solution architect with Microsoft Services. As a bit of background, I actually came over to Microsoft through the FAST acquisition, so my primary background is in search itself.
Dan Benson, I'm a senior consultant for Microsoft Consulting Services. I actually started with FAST about 2 weeks after Paul, so we've been doing this for about 6 years. It's been that long. And thank you for coming after a long week of sessions. We appreciate it, especially you guys in the back right.
Yeah, the room layout's a little bit weird, but I won't have that awkward moment asking everybody to come into the middle. So. Anyway, so the goal of our conversation today is to give you some hints about how you can build applications on top of SharePoint Search. We're doing it in the context of Windows 8, and we're going to give you some hints and pointers about how to leverage the Windows 8 controls and features to build effective search applications. But just as much, we want you to walk away from this presentation understanding that we can use SharePoint Search as a search service layer for any sort of application, whether it's built on the LAMP stack or it's a iOS app. The APIs in SharePoint 2013 Search are really flexible and robust and allow you to build any type of application on it. That's actually true of all the SharePoint APIs, but we'll be focusing on Search today. So yes, we'll talk about the APIs. We'll be specifically focusing on the REST APIs because that's what works best for us for our app. But we'll try and pivot around and talk about any other APIs. And if you have questions about the other APIs or why we made the decisions we made, please raise your hand. As a matter of fact, raise your hand regardless. I'd rather this be a little bit interactive if possible. If you're in one of the extreme wings here, though, I may not see you, so you might have to.
Especially you guys in the back right.
You may have to shout. So we'll talk about the APIs, then we'll talk about how we wire some of this stuff together. And again, while we're going to be very specific using C# and Windows 8, I hope that you can look at this from whatever application model you'll be using and be able to pull something away from it in that sense. And then finally, we'll be giving some hints and pointers about the design considerations specifically for Windows 8, using the search charm, using various data binding controls, stuff like that. So just a refresher, I don't know how many of you have seen a lot of the search sessions since you've been here, probably one or two. This is a standard slide that we all kind of tried to coordinate and use across them, so this probably looks familiar. I wanted to present this slide to focus on three core pieces. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but on the left of the slide is the content sources. And as you can see with SharePoint 2013 Search, we very much make we follow on with the fast search for SharePoint paradigm of being able to ingest content from any of the sources within your enterprise or outside your enterprise. Web crawling, line of business apps, file shares, whatever you want to consume. The connector framework, mostly BCS, but that's another long conversation. But suffice it to say, we can get whatever data we need. And I emphasize that point primarily to continue to try and convince you that this can be an enterprise service layer for your entire company. So you don't have to have siloed search systems. You can have a central service farm for search. The other thing I wanted to point out is the analytics processing engine. As we talk through our presentation today, I think it helps create some of the data that allows us to build compelling, rich client-side applications, and that mainly from a personalization perspective. So capturing popularity content, being able to leverage pivot around recommendations so that we can surface a lot of different types of content for our users. And then finally, to the right on this slide is the API layer. So with SharePoint 2013 Search, or SharePoint 2013 in general, we've added a full set of REST APIs. We have our standard .NET client APIs. And actually, that's my next slide, so I'll just hop over there. This is an image that I pulled from a TechNet article, and I put a short URL to that TechNet article. I think the title of the TechNet article is like, choosing the right API for my SharePoint. And so, but this gives you a layout of what it all looks like. And so we have our server side, our .NET Client APIs, our JavaScript APIs, the REST APIs, and then the Silverlight Windows Phone APIs. And these are available for all the components, but that includes search. And for instance, if you came from if you have any background with the old fast software, one of our primary endpoint was that HTTP interface. And with SharePoint 2013 Search, we had to use the web service one. And I feel like for some of us, it got hard to debug, troubleshoot, and build more flexible applications on it. But that comes back to us in 2013 with the REST-based API. So I know for me, I was really excited to see it. So where does Windows 8 fall in that mix? So I've put that little graphic in there. It overlaps the REST and the JavaScript APIs. Those are the two APIs we have to choose from when we're building Windows 8 apps. The .NET libraries, at least in my testing, the .NET Client Object Model APIs, do not work with Windows 8. There must be some library dependencies that are not supported by the WinRT runtime. So we have to use JavaScript or the REST APIs. For our application, we chose to use the REST API. We could have gone the JavaScript HTML5 route for our Windows 8 app, but Dan and I are just more comfortable coding C#, so we did it that way. But there's no reason we couldn't have gone the HTML5 JavaScript route and used those libraries. So to set a little bit more baseline for us and talk about the vocabulary that will be thrown out there today. The first thing is WinRT. That's the runtime environment in Windows 8 that allows us to develop on all these different languages. So we can use JavaScript, C++, C#, or Visual Basic. Again, we use C# for our application, so that's what we'll be demoing today. Then there's the CSOM, which is the client-side object model for SharePoint. And again, I just went through the APIs in that last slide. We can use the .NET, or for all apps, we could use .NET libraries, JavaScript, or REST. Windows 8, we're sort of limited to JavaScript and the REST API. POCO is a term I pulled up off the internet, and that's just kind of a play off the plain old Java object thing. It's just our objects that we're moving throughout the application. And so what we do, and I'll show this in a second, but we built a wrapper around the REST API that was WinRT friendly, and we built our own object model around it. So then REST, representational state transfer. So it's the stateless client-server software for distributed systems, and again, it's an HTTP-based request-response model. In SharePoint 2013 Search, we can get our response in either XML or JSON. We chose XML, that's what we started with and stuck it out with that. So, and then OData is the data format for transferring the data, and it's designed to support this CRUD model, so create, retrieve, update, delete. For our presentation, we're just talking about retrieve. This is search. But there is no reason you couldn't interface with some of the other list APIs through an app and support all those operations. So again, why did we choose REST? It's a little bit redundant, I apologize. But we chose it because we wanted to code in C#, not JavaScript, and we weren't allowed to use those .NET libraries for our app. For your apps, depending on the framework you're using, if you're building a Windows desktop app, you could have used the .NET libraries. But this just gives you kind of a little bit of an overview of what the layers are that get us down to SharePoint. And that client.svc is actually aliased to us by the URLs for the REST APIs. And here's what those look like. So those bottom four lines on the right give us the mapping to the REST APIs, and that we're using, at least for our search, and they're very similar for other services. But they're essentially an alias on top of client.svc, which I actually learned putting this presentation together. I wasn't aware of that. So what does our application architecture look like? Well, you can see that within the WinRT environment, we have two primary layers. We have our view layer, which consists of all of our Windows 8 pages, our layouts, the styles, the controls, the data binding. We get a handle on the search pane for the search charm in there. And then we've built a WinRT-friendly wrapper around the REST API. Our wrapper doesn't expose every parameter, search parameter, nor does it even return the full object structure, but that was just a time limitation on our side. What we would like to do is to continue to build on that code and then start to expose all the query parameters that are available to us, or at least the ones that we think are valuable. We make HTTP calls in there. We use linked XML to marshal the XML response into POCOs. And then we send those POCOs back up the stack and do standard data binding. And it's, most of the work is done in that wrapper layer. All the code logic in our pages is very simple data binding. It's very clean. Well, our code isn't super clean, but the model is clean. I've listed off 4 different APIs that we leverage within this application. Obviously, we lean the hardest on that first one, which is the REST API for search. And you can see the path there. And it's just a string of query parameters after that. The list of query parameters are out on TechNet. We'll talk about a few of them and some of the things that I think change as we move into the a more rich client model, whether that's web-based or in the app model. We'll talk about that later. We also have the suggestions API, which is really great. It allows us to do type ahead and get those suggestions directly from SharePoint. We can load those up manually, or we can let the system kind of generate them based on successful searches. Then we have the social APIs, and the social API is great for personalization of your app. I think that as we go into this app model and we have an app running on our desktop, our users are starting to think that, or demand really, that these applications be personalized for us. They think we're not this anonymous person heading out to the web anymore. This is my laptop. You should know more about me, or my tablet. And so we're able to personalize the user experience by leaning on our social APIs. I did a presentation yesterday about this specifically, and so you can go back and get the details. But we'll talk about a little more about that at the end of this presentation as well. Building upon that, we also have the user profile API via REST, and we're actually going to show you an even cooler thing using query rules to personalize the user experience that leans on the user profile object in SharePoint. Dan's going to
So I'm going to take a few minutes of your time to show you the actual app and how we use those APIs. Okay. This is Visual Studio. How many of you have been in here? Okay, that's a good number. All right. So basically, we just built an app based on a template that we're going to show you how easy it is to build this. But I want to walk through basically 3 screens we have for this app, and it's quite simple, actually. So the first is there's a zero-term query here. If you look at the Content for Me section, you have 10 results that are based on, as Paul mentioned, a query rule that basically just says, give me everything in the search index, but rank them based on my interests. So for example, I'm logged in as Paul. You can see his picture up there. If you look at his interests, so we're in SharePoint 2013 looking at his My Site. You can see his interests are enterprise search, search-driven applications, SharePoint 2013. So what we're doing is...
Dan, hide my phone number. Jeez, what are you doing to me here?
Oh, sorry about that. Please call Paul if you have any technical problems. Sorry about that. So anyway, he has a bunch of nerdy interests there. So we take that query and we use an SQL operator called xrank to basically bring back a list of results that, he's interested in. So back to our app.
You turned it off. You have to
I did.
relaunch
That's
it.
all right. So again, the first set of results on the left is just a bunch of results. We've launched this app that Paul is interested in, right? That we believe he's interested in. He has these interests, so bring these things to the top. The next, as you look over to what would be your left, is a list of documents that he has authored. So these are two distinct result blocks that we'll talk about later that come back from a SharePoint query. And finally, we're using the user profile API to get his information and his picture there. So now, that's the home screen. Now what do we do? How do we query this thing? So the design paradigm for using Windows 8 and querying is basically to use the search charm. Okay, so you can get to that in two different ways. The main way is to use the Windows key and Q, and it brings up this search charm that allows you to search either multiple of these things, apps on your machine. In this case, we're in the app. So we use what we'll talk about as the search contract to search our app. So I'm just going to type.
As you probably know, if you're using a tablet, the swipe in from the right side of your tablet will expose the charms menu, and then you choose the search charm to get to this. But if you're on a desktop, Windows Q. And I was doing some training around Windows 8 development, and we had a whole section on search, and they said the message from Microsoft is that all applications should use the search charm and not have their own search box. But if you pull up the Bing app, it has its own search box. I'm like, wait a minute. And the explanation that they gave is that the goal here is to give seamless experiences for our users, no matter how we're searching. So I should know that I can always search. I can just hit Windows Q and it'll search my app. Regardless of what app I'm in, I don't have to go out to some desktop search thing or anything like that. But they do also want people to feel consistent experience using Bing, whether using the Bing app or the Bing web-based, using Bing on the web, or whether that's in the Windows 8 browser or the desktop browser. So they're kind of balancing these goals of consistent experiences.
So this is basically the second screen, and you'll notice just underneath the search charm, I have query suggestions. And Paul was talking about that API, so we can talk to SharePoint and get back the query suggestions that it has. It also has a brief history of query suggestions, so it will mix those. And so this page is just a list of results based on the relevance model in SharePoint 2013 and based on our query. So we go through here and we can, you'll notice there's a new panel there with refiners. So the model for refiners is basically this drop-down list at the top. You'll see that in the Windows Store. So we can filter by who the author is. We'll change the list of results, file type, et cetera, et cetera.
And primarily because of time, we didn't implement the ability to capture the breadcrumb trail, so to be able to back out of that stuff. But that shouldn't, that'll be for our next year's presentation.
Yeah, so sign up for that. Thirdly, the last screen, we have implemented a landing page, basically. And this page, for some documents, has just an icon and description. For others, we have implemented the web view control, so you can actually preview a web page inside of the landing page. And we're using a flip view control that allows us to page ahead, along with the notion of prefetching. Do you want to?
Yeah, so again, as we have these rich client apps, I think expectations from our users are really changing. And so no longer we have this paradigm of next page, or, you have pages 1 through 300. Right. We want to kind of just allow them to just swipe through them, keep going, all the way till the end. I mean, if they go through 1,500 results, I think our search has a problem, but assuming, maybe it's the 20th or the 25th result or something like that, allow them to just continue to swipe, and our application in the background is going off and getting that data in advance and loading up the objects for us so that experience is very fluid and easy, and the user's just, user doesn't know they're paging, but they are in the background. Cool. Another, just to build on what Dan shows you here, is the way we've implemented this page is to use a data template selector. Is that the right word, I think? A data template selector, which allows us to display different windows or different layouts based on a condition in our data. So what my data template selector says is, if this is a web-based page, I'm going to render my custom web view control. If this is a PDF, because I don't have a tool for rendering a PDF in the page, then I'm going to just display a bunch of metadata about the page, about the content item, really. It was fairly, I did it fairly rigidly. Just ASPX, file type ASPX or file type HTML pulls off the web view control. But I think we could implement more complex rules and a variety of different layouts to accommodate our different content types. I mean, it would have been, probably would have been good for me if it had been a conversation item, for instance, to display that differently, or maybe pull back the whole conversation right into this page. And what we're really doing is we're really taking advantage of the rich application controls in the Windows 8 application to create a more immersive, seamless search experience. And so I think that as we embrace those design paradigms, it'll be interesting. The other idea that I'd had, and I didn't have time to implement, but it's worth looking into, is the ability to then leverage the WAC server to go out and actually get the preview that we see in the hover panels and render them through the web view control. So there are a lot of different things we can do here by combining SharePoint and the Windows 8 tools.
So some people might not have caught on to what the WAC is.
Oh, I'm sorry. The WAC, I don't even actually, the web access or...
Whatever, it's the Office.
Yeah, it's the Office rendering.
It's how you get previews.
Yeah, it's how you get document previews and how you do web-based document authoring for SharePoint. So that's what, and it's a standalone, SharePoint 2013, it's no longer a service app, it's a standalone element. So we can talk to it. We can also build in custom rendering tools there for different document types. So.
Okay, and so one of the things for you people that, raised your hands, have been in Visual Studio, this is actually, and we'll get into some of the code later, but this is actually just a very simple, we're getting the REST XML results and just transforming them and binding them to a grid full of these tiles that you're seeing in front of you. So it's a very simple transformation. Doesn't take a lot of code to get this done. Any questions before I move on to the next? About to show you that.
Yeah, that's our next.
Great question. Did we plant you? That was awesome.
Yeah, the question was if we used one of the out-of-box templates for our application, and Dan's actually jumping in right.
So I'm just going to show you real quick. There's a different slide, but we'll skip that. How to create this app. And basically, again, like we said, there was only 3 screens. We'll show you where we got 2 of them. It's pretty easy. You just go File, New Project. I know the font's a little small, but. So under Templates, Visual C#, in the Windows store, there's some out-of-the-box templates we have. And so we chose the Grid app. So you just create a new project based on that template.
And when I started this, so I kicked this off and I decided to go, I had built an app with just a blank template. I went back and I wanted to leverage the way we can return multiple result blocks with a single query and kind of show how Windows 8 can really seamlessly support that. And so I was like, all right, how do I do that? I don't know. And I go in, and there's that app template, and it just, I took my old code, and I just modified how the objects were structured a little bit, and the data binding was really seamless.
And again, while it looks slick, it's just really binding the data you're getting back from SharePoint 2013 to a grid, just like in the old days, like it used to look in basically like an Excel spreadsheet. There's a couple pages we used here. The grouped items page, you'll recognize this. We changed it up a little bit, but you have your tiles in a grid layout. And then there is the item detail page. So this is when you click through and you want to see what is that search result about more and more. And Paul implemented the flip view to allow us to scroll through each of these details.
And the flip view page, I talked about the data template selector. I actually built a custom control using the it's a really basic code, but it has a web view object. And it also has a progress ring, so when it's rendering it's pulling back the data for that web page that I'm giving you a preview of. It puts the progress ring on top of it until it's done, and so the event handlers allow us to take the progress ring away and just show the web view control with the page rendered in there.
Okay, so how do I get out of here? I was going to show you how we implemented the search contract.
Yep. Do you want to flip over the slide deck?
Yeah, flip to the slide deck. Here we go.
So just to take a step back and have you give you a view of what our object structure looks like. So we have at the top left our search pane, which is the standard entry point probably for this application for the most part. Dan showed you that home page, and what that home page does is it takes a pre-canned query term that we've embedded in the app itself, and I think we will show you that. So it kind of skips that search pane step, and it becomes the query text. And then that query text gets launched and gets sent to the page. The page makes a call to my search manager, passing in the query itself, the query text, and any transformations we may do in the client on that query. It also provides the security principal object, and we'll talk very briefly about authentication with these Windows 8 apps. But all that data is shipped off to the search manager, so that's our core entry point for executing searches, and he or she makes the call into the REST API, and then returns us our result objects. And those result objects are a tiered structure. Essentially, we have a collection. I have my results. They're contained within a result object, which also contains some metadata about the result itself. You know, how many hits there were in there, if the search engine did any query transformations on it, if it fired a query rule, that sort of thing. And I can have multiple result objects per results group. And that allows us to do that like automatic data binding in the page. So if I get multiple result groups for a given given query, I can then bind that into that grouped items page. And we will, I think Dan's going to show us where that data binding happens. There's also the search and suggestions API. So that's the search pane, or that's my application layer talking directly to the search manager. It doesn't hop through any pages because I need that search pane object. I need to load that search pane object up with those suggestions. So I talk directly to the search manager. It goes out to the suggestions API and returns those. And then on the other side, I have my social manager. So I created a wrapper around the social REST APIs as well so that I can get social data about people. And that includes user profile information. And I pass that back up to allow us to personalize the experience a little bit more.
So just to jump back into the code real quick, show you how easy it is to implement that search contract using the search charm that talks to the applications. It's really, as you can see, it's 3 lines of code. You're basically just grabbing the search charm, and then you're implementing, for our purposes, 2 event handlers. The query submitted, which sends the query to the landing page along with an argument, which I'll show you, and the suggestions. So let me get out of here and scroll down and show you that. So here's the 2 event handlers. The suggestions go through the search manager, as Paul was talking about, and get suggestions from SharePoint 2013. And then on the query submitted, again, it's a very simple amount of code. You're just saying, get me the query text from that box, grab the frame of the current content, and navigate to what is our grouped items page, which is what I showed you, the template with all the tiles on it, giving the argument of the query text. So it's actually pretty easy to implement that.
And then above that is the suggestions requested event handler. And so that's, as I said, just going out to Search Manager, and it's populating this collection of query suggestions. The one interesting thing that I learned while putting this together has to do with that search pane suggestions request deferral object. And so my confession is that I don't actually know what I'm doing there, but I figured out that if I don't include that top line and then that bottom line, I get a weird runtime exception. And I've deduced that it must be related to the time it's taking to make that call. Because if I just hard coded the suggestions into this method, I don't get that runtime exception. So, Windows 8 was designed, or the app model was designed to make sure that all your responses were very quick and that the application continued to be fluid regardless of what you were doing in the background. And I think this is another protection layer for that. Should we stop? Does anybody have any questions or anything you'd like us to go into more detail on? Or, yeah. I have to dig out. The question is, do I know anything else about that deferral? Because I'm probably doing something wrong. Yeah, I couldn't get around it. I tried, and it may be related to the response time from my suggestions request, because I was using, before this app, I was using a much slower VM, and it was just the response times on it weren't that great. So it may be related to that response time. As I said, with all the asynchronous model in Windows 8, it's very sensitive to that kind of performance. And, I wouldn't call it a protection layer, because the fact that, one of your the fact that I was getting a runtime exception there was, and it was a very obscure one. It wasn't like, performance exception or something like that. It was just like some weird system level exception. It ran asynchronously. So, but it's directly within the suggestions pane. So the search pane. So the search pane is making, with every letter, every letter the user types in, it's calling this event handler. And so, maybe it was the volume of the request it was making, and maybe there's some sort of call stack that was getting screwed up. I need to dig into it. I didn't find this code in official documentation either. I found it some random blog out there. Someone had the same problem as me, and this is how they solved it. So, another question? Security. We're going to talk about that towards the end of the presentation. We don't have a ton of. I'll tell you how we did it, but there's other. My big question. I wanted to implement this against SharePoint Online. And there's some challenges with the OAuth authentication there. So I'll probably be pointing you to other people to really get a good answer, but we'll talk about it. So there are so here are the key elements for implementing the search pane, or the search charm, and it's called the search contract. And what you're doing is you have to make an app declaration in your package.manifest file and tell it that you're implementing search. And as soon as you do that, and your app gets loaded onto your machine, it'll show up as one of the options in that list of apps in the search pane. Well, not drop down, but that list at the bottom. So any app that implements the search contract in your system should appear in that list. So if you're on your desktop and you do Windows Q and you go, or you swipe in and you enter search terms, the default may not be your app, but the user will have the option of picking it right from there. So again, no matter what context the user's in, they can pivot into the various apps that support the search contract. And then here's just kind of a refresher. We have to get a handle on that search pane object and implement these two events, event handlers to process the input from the user. What's next? Oh, we already did that.
Yep.
Oops. Slides are out of order. So let's talk a little bit more about the Search REST API and what the kind of parameters we have at our disposal. We offer the standard query parameters. You know, the query text parameter is what you're entering your complex or simple query to the user. I won't go deep into query language. We'll look a little bit at it in a bit, but you know, that can, you know, our limits there are bound to the GET request limit, whatever that is. And we even actually, I'm pretty sure Search API supports POST through REST as well. So we have a lot of control there. You know, we can specify our sort list. We specify the refiners we want to get returned. We can specify any refinement filters that the user has applied. So Dan showed you those drop downs. Those are going into that refinement filters list. The response from SharePoint, when it gets a refiner, actually gives us it makes it very easy to take the refiner, take a value from that refiner object and just send it back to the search engine. So it gives us that syntax already. We don't have to do any real manipulation there. I italicized pagination because of what I mentioned to you all earlier about how we're not really paginating anymore, or I don't think that's quite the design people are looking for. And if you look at, for instance, the Bing app, there's no pagination. It's just as you swipe across, you know, it's reloading more search results in the background. And I think we even see that in more modern web-based applications as well. You know, we have JavaScript in the background reloading, you know, loading more results into the page so people don't have to do that pagination. So we also have some more modern search features, you know, refiners and sorting. I talked a little bit about that. I italicized best bets because, as you probably have heard, is quote-unquote best bets are no longer in the product, right? We implement best bets now through query rules. And query rules are considerably more flexible and give us a lot more control over the user experience. And so we are going to do a little quick jump into query rules because I think that query rules are important for how we manage the user experience. So query rules can be managed at the farm, site collection, or site level. And so I've gone into my site administration here. And you can see I'm an administrator, so I have the site collection rules at my disposal here as well. And the rule I implemented was at the site collection level. So query rules kind of pivot around our result sources. And a result source is a logical collection of data within the index. And we can create result source off by filtering on any attribute. So we could create the result sources in a separate area. But we could say create a result source for new content, and it's just a filter against search. So it's, you know, date, you know, author date greater than or earlier than a certain date. And we could create a result source that way, or my content authored by Dan, or anything of that nature. By default, this is the list of result sources we have. I created my query rule against the local SharePoint results. And this is how I was able to create that zero-term experience in that home page. So I'm going to show you what this looks like.
Yeah, so the first page we showed you in the app, that first result set, based on Paul's interest I was talking about, this is how it was done.
So I have a number of options for how I can have a query rule trigger. I use as an exact keyword match, but we can also match against dictionaries and also more advanced methods like regular expressions. I actually have a query rule on this system that fires for any query term. It does personalization based on any query term. So my regular expression is just, you know, if they enter anything, then fire this query rule. But for this one, we use the Win8 homepage, so we're very specific. Then you can see down here, I've added a promoted result. So that's our best bets. It used to be that we created we had this, this entity within SharePoint called a best bet. Well, now we add it as a piece of content or a result element within a query rule. And then I added an extra result block. And an extra result block, again, is just another segment of data that comes back in our response. And it's based on a query that we define. So I'll show you what that looks like as well. And so what I do is I create a result title, and that's great because that gives me metadata that I can then display at rendering time. And then I'm able to configure a query that will define the content that gets returned in this result block. And for this, I said I want to have any content that's been authored by the current user. And that's me, so I say user.name, and that gets me that. A few other configuration elements in here. I won't go into that detail. Then the other option we have is for the regular result set, I can transform the query. And this is actually, I think, one of the, show you something really cool. At least I think it's cool. So you can see down here, I take the query, and I could include the input terms. So a query rule could transform the query and still include the original query terms. And that's what I did with my regular expression one that I was just talking about. But for this one, I'm getting rid of that. I don't want Win8 homepage. That's no good to me. So what I do is I create a query to get all the content in the index, size greater than 0. I'm not sure if that's the best way to get all the content in the index, but that's the way I've been using for years. And then I'm going to leverage the xrank parameter, which allows us to do query time boosting based on query time parameters. So it's not a filter, but a mechanism for adding rank points to content that match the query expression that comes after it. xrank was available in SharePoint, in Fast Search for SharePoint 2010, but only using the FQL query language. It's now been added to KQL. As a matter of fact, in general, KQL and FQL have a lot more parity with this release. The highlighted section now, though, is giving me access to the user profile object from directly within the query rule. So this is a no-code personalization approach. And so what I'm doing is I have access to this user object, and I use this syntax to then reference the interests that they've listed specifically within their profile. And the pipe syntax here, so I could have said, if I remove that pipe, it wouldn't support multi-value. But with that pipe, it's supporting multi-value user profile attributes. And so this is going to create a large query expression based on any of the interests I've defined in my profile. So I'll show you what that looks like. So this is the query builder and allows us to test our queries directly as we create the query rule versus having to flip out into another UI. But this is the query. So if I fire Win8 homepage, for my regular results, this is the query that gets created dynamically using that user profile object. So that syntax gives me access to that user profile object. And you can see these are the interests I've listed in my user profile. And so that will automatically, so it goes out, looks at all the content, and then boosts the content from the index that's related to me. Again, with these rich client apps, we want to give the users a personalized experience. And this is one easy no-code way to do it. So then how do I bring this back into Windows 8, or my Windows 8 app? So in app.get, I create an application level parameter, Win8 homepage. As you can see, that aligns with the query term that matches, let me zoom in, that matches the trigger condition for my query rule. And then in home.xaml, I get a handle on that query string up here, and then I have some abstraction layers here. I create a query object, assign my query string as that term that I've defined in app.xaml. I go in here, I issue a search, and I get my search results group back. And I did some manipulation of the header value, but for the most part, this is all I do. I get my search results back, and I data bind it to the page control right there, and that renders all the results in that grouped format, and done. So that's how we are able to leverage query rules within. So there's a lot of ways to leverage query rules. I mean, any query rule that fires, will affect the experience of the results that come back. But this is a way to give that kind of zero-term search approach and that personalized homepage approach when a user hasn't actually told you anything that they're here to do yet. You surface that content for them. I also think the query rules are compelling because they give us some server-side access, some server-side control of the user experience. So any query transformations we do in the client app, we'd have to modify, in the app itself and, send out an update to the app. But the more we can lean on query rules, the more we can affect the user experience without having to rebuild our app. What's next?
That was actually a lot of talking. Does anybody have questions on that?
Right here. Yes. Right. Yes. Yeah, you have a limited, it's not, obviously you don't have farm level control, but. Oh, sorry. The question was if we have control over query rules and result blocks in Office 365. And the answer is yes, but obviously, you have it at the site collection level, not at the farm level. So. Yes, that's how I did it. But if your data, so the question was how did I populate the icons in the page? So when the app renders, I display a different icon. I mean, kind of standard stuff. I display a different icon depending on the type of content it is. And I did that fairly brute force in my in the code that marshals that XML into those just those .NET objects. But if I had an attribute on my content that reflected the thumbnail URL, for instance, I could have leveraged that as well. I could have easily taken that. Anyone else? Questions? Actually doing pretty well with time here. Cool. So, we talked through all this modern UI stuff, how we're able to leverage the grid layouts and the data binding within our Windows 8 app and combine that with SharePoint Search and this result block model very seamlessly. So it's a great synergy between the two technologies. So what are some of the other considerations? I've talked through prefetching a little bit. The idea there is that in any of our pages, as I'm swiping through results or I'm flip viewing through results, to make sure that the application is doing more work in the background to make sure that experience seems very fluid for our users. The flip view control, I think that's a really compelling, rich experience for our users to surface as much information about our result as they possibly can right within that screen. So our users don't have this, they have less of a challenge identifying the content they want, having to go out and get it, figure out that it works for them, or throw it away. Now we can get a lot more insight into our data directly within the app. One of the thoughts, though, with like the prefetching approach, and as we page through stuff, well, how much content, how much stress is going to put on the system as I get to later and later in the result set. With Fast Search for SharePoint, we had a limit defined within the product, but also a configurable limit defined in the product. But it was more of a performance guidance limit, and that we hit 4,020 results, then you couldn't page any further into the result set. And with SharePoint 2013 and talking a little bit with the product group, we think that limit is much higher now. Where that limit is, you can go pretty much as far as you want, but you need to figure out where the performance starts to really degrade at that point if you get too deep into the result set. The other side of that, of course, is if your users are paging to the 5,000 pit in your result set, there's probably an issue with your relevance, and want to maybe take a look at that.
Yeah, most of that limit was based on e-discovery type purposes where, an automation script or something is paging through several results. Usually people won't page through 10 results at a time to get to 4,020. So you got a relevance problem if they're doing that.
Okay, so quick talk about authentication with our app. For our app, we used our Windows credentials to authenticate against our domain-joined SharePoint 2013 system. And that was necessary to authenticate. Otherwise, we get a 401 response back. For SharePoint Online, I really wanted to have a better discussion about that. The main reason I included a slide is because I didn't want anybody to think I was ignoring this as a consideration. SharePoint Online will be supporting OAuth for this. And I've put in the corner there another session that's covering this in more detail by one of the product team members named Seshamani. And unfortunately, it's going on right now as well, so you'll have to watch the video. But it's about how we use an OAuth exchange to authenticate against SharePoint Online when using the REST APIs. And there are some limitations to how SharePoint Online supports OAuth right now, and that conversation's evolving. And rather than trying to talk to you guys based on my very limited knowledge of OAuth, I would prefer that you went out to Sesha's session and get the real details there. Anybody have any questions about authentication? I will do my best to answer. I cannot answer that question. Yeah. The question was if I'm signed into my Windows 8 machine and I'm, when we sign into Windows 8 machines, we use a live ID, or I think it's called a Windows ID now. Microsoft account, thank you. Sign in with our Microsoft account. Is there a way to associate that with our SharePoint Online credentials so that we don't have to do any explicit login? We can just have that exchange happen in the background. I don't know. I think I would be surprised if that isn't covered in another session, but I don't know the answer. I apologize. I see someone shaking their head in the back, right? The answer is yes? Okay. Okay. Was that topic covered? Okay.
Okay, so the answer is yes.
Authoritatively. So we'll move on from authentication. Scary. Security is very complicated. So just again, I want to reiterate about personalization. I think it's the demand that's coming from so many organizations is how can we personalize our user experiences. I really believe that SharePoint 2013 in general gives us so much information, particularly for enterprise applications. It gives us so much information about our users. Here are some of the APIs that we can leverage to personalize user experiences. Through our social APIs, we get a handle on the people we're following, the content we're following, the tags we're following. The user profile API gives us access to all our user profile attributes. And as I showed you with that query rule, we can leverage the user profile object without any code. And so I would encourage you to, as you build applications in general, whatever environment you're building it on, to consider these APIs and consider ways that this data can improve your users' experiences. We get, the requests coming down from almost all of my customers. We got search. It was really good at first. Now people want more. They want better. And SharePoint gives us that. And as we have, and I think those demands are just going to be bigger and louder as they start deploying these rich client apps for everybody. So that's our talk. Let me, if anybody would like us to dive into the code in any other ways, or look at any other aspects of the app, I'd be happy to do that. We have a few more minutes. Actually, we have 20 more minutes, including Q&A. So,
before you take off, don't forget to rate this session. We want your actual feedback, as long as it's 5s.
Yes.
Okay.
We want your honest opinion, as long as it's a 5. I see a question in the back. That's correct, through the search charm. Yeah. So the question is, can we launch the app just through the search charm? And the answer is yes, and we're going to show you how that works. My fear, however, is that because I've deployed the app just in debug mode, I am concerned that it might not launch correctly, but we'll give it a shot. So I hit Windows Q, same as a swipe in and touching the search charm. So let me just back out to my desktop. So I can come down here, I get my charms menu and hit search. So that would be the swipe method. And I want to search for fast. And I just hit I'm going to click on the Contoso Internet app. Hopefully it. So what it should do is go to, I'm going to back out.
Unscripted demos.
Yeah. What it should do is head to my app.xaml.cs. It's going to fire this event. Let me zoom in.
So maybe if it's running in the background, then it'll fire up.
It should go to this event handler automatically, which will forward it to my grouped items page, and then my group items page will issue the search. Yeah, let me do it that way, Dan. Let me see if that works. So I'm gonna start the app in debug mode. But your question was specifically if the app's not running as well, so let me launch it. Another thing actually is worth pointing out. So I'm going to back into here. Now it's running in the background, but I should be able to hop into it now. Definitely making a liar out of me here.
Click search.
One of the enhancements I'm looking to do is add some of those progress ring controls to let people know that something's happening in the background as well. But yeah, so unscripted demo. I apologize. That should work. So Dan just fudged it for us, but that should work. I should be able to go right into the app. As a matter of fact, I could demo it against the Bing app. Would probably be a good way of doing it. So,
or the store.
So my Bing app is definitely not running. If I just come down here. Now, if this doesn't work, it's not my fault. But there you go. So that's the way our app should work as well. So we have some testing and debugging to do. For those of you who haven't gotten into Windows 8 development too much but are getting started, I think one of the really cool things they offer is this simulator. I've had some issues on my desktop with it, but it basically creates another console entry point into your machine, but in a view of a tablet device. I'll just give you what it looks like when it fires up. I don't know if it'll load. So if you start doing development, this is really cool. It has controls on the right-hand side that allow you to simulate gestures. Now my whole machine's going to crash. Just watch. But simulate gestures, including the semantic zoom. Here we go. Cool, it's working. See, so this is the exact same application. And it's actually just like another instance of my desktop in the background. But I can simulate semantic zoom, reorienting the device, all the snap gestures, all that stuff. So as you're starting to do your development and doing debugging for the user experience, either you don't have a tablet at your disposal or you don't want to, or you don't want to be hopping from tablet into your main development environment, you can leverage this to debug and troubleshoot. So I think that was worth showing.
But you should have a tablet, a Surface.
Yes.
Or an iPad.
Because they're free. I think they're giving them out on the way out. Let's plug a couple of other sessions. If you want more information about search, there's some hands-on labs. I didn't include Windows 8 stuff in here, mainly in my haste to get this stuff done. But there have been a lot of search sessions about customizing your search experience. As you can see, most of them are past, but I would go out and check out the videos. And then, as Dan said, please give us a good rating. Because this was a great session, right?
Thank you, guys.